The air inside the Pierce Aero factory on Elmwood Avenue in Buffalo in the autumn of 1915 was thick with the smell of hot aluminum, machine oil, and something harder to name, the particular atmospheric pressure of absolute certainty. Nearly 10,000 men and women moved through 1.5 million square feet of reinforced concrete every day, feeding raw steel into machines that bent and pressed and shaped it into objects that would be driven by presidents and kings. The sawtooth glass panels set into the production floor's ceiling caught the pale October light and scattered it evenly across every workbench, every assembly station, every engine block being lowered with surgical precision onto its mounts by men who had performed the same operation so many thousands of times that their hands moved without instruction from their conscious minds. The air smelled of purpose. It smelled of a company that had decided in its earliest days exactly what it was going to be, and had spent 50 years becoming it. Outside, on the railroad siding running along the northern edge of the complex, finished automobiles were being loaded onto freight cars. Each car had been assembled by hand, inspected component by component, and tested on the road before being cleared for delivery. The cars were heading to garages in New York and Washington and London and Tokyo, to the men who ran Standard Oil, to the official fleet of the White House, to the royal courts of Japan and Persia and Belgium. The factory that produced them occupied 34 acres of North Buffalo, employed a workforce the size of a small town, and generated $4 million in annual profit. By any measure available to the people inside it, this was the most successful automobile company in the world. The men running this factory were certain of exactly one thing. They built the finest automobiles on earth. Not among the finest, not among the top three, the finest. Full stop. And they intended to keep it that way regardless of what the competition was doing in Detroit, regardless of what the market was demanding, and regardless, ultimately, of what the entire collapsing American economy would have to say about it in the decades ahead. That certainty was not arrogance in the ordinary sense. It was a philosophy, constructed carefully over half a century, beginning not with engines and chassis, but with gilded wire bent into decorative shapes in a small workshop downtown. It was so deeply embedded in the institutional character of this company that no shareholder meeting, no financial crisis, no competitive pressure from rivals with deeper pockets and more modern machinery could dislodge it. The philosophy was the company, and the company was the philosophy. And that is precisely what makes the story of what happened next so difficult to watch. This is not a story about a company that failed because it built inferior products. Every surviving Pierce Aero in the world today, the roughly 3,000 examples from a total production run of approximately 80,000 that managed to outlast the company that made them, stands as a testament to the fact that the engineering was extraordinary, the craftsmanship was genuine, and the cars were exactly what the people who built them believed them to be. This is a story about a company that was destroyed by the uncompromising perfection of its own convictions. A story about what happens when a philosophy stops being a competitive advantage and becomes, instead, an invisible wall between a great company and the compromises that survival requires. And a story about the specific, documented historical cost of refusing to become something lesser in order to remain alive. Before we go further, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments, because Pierce Aero had devoted owners and passionate customers from Buffalo to Beverly Hills, from the drawing rooms of the White House to the imperial courts of Japan. And I want to know where this story finds you. If you're new here, subscribe and stay for the full ride. This one goes all the way to the end, and the end is the part that matters most. Now, the man who started all of this arrived in Buffalo in the middle of the Civil War with no money and no plan, and he began by making birdcages. George Norman Pierce came to Buffalo in 1863 at the age of 17, the youngest of 11 children raised on a farm in Friendsville, Pennsylvania. Friendsville was a place of such modest scale and quiet expectation that ambition must have felt almost physically uncomfortable there. The kind of town that produces people who either stay forever or leave immediately and never look back. Pierce left. He arrived in Buffalo with nothing identifiable as a credential, took whatever work was available and spent his first years learning the city the way immigrants and arrivals have always learned unfamiliar cities, by working inside it until it became familiar. In 1865, 2 years after his arrival, he partnered with two other men, Heinz and Munschauer, to form a manufacturing company. They made household goods, ice chests, tinware, washing machines, and bird cages. The bird cages were the product that made the company's reputation, and they deserve more than a footnote because the birdcage is where the Pierce Arrow story actually begins. George Pierce did not make functional bird cages. He made beautiful ones. Gilded, precisely assembled, finished with a care that exceeded any utilitarian requirement. He was making objects that would sit in the parlors of Buffalo's growing middle class and be admired by people who had no particular interest in birds, but a very strong interest in the quality of the objects that populated their homes. The customer was paying for craftsmanship. Pierce was providing it. The exchange established a commercial relationship quality as the foundation of the value proposition that would define every product he made for the rest of his life. In 1872, he bought out his partners and renamed the business the George N. Pierce Company. He was 26 years old, operating alone for the first time, and the thing he had learned from the birdcage business was that the market for quality was reliable in a way that the market for ordinary goods was not. People who bought expensive things because the expensive things were genuinely better than cheaper alternatives were customers who came back. Pierce built his entire strategy around that observation and never abandoned it. He continued making household goods through the 1870s and into the 80s, building the company's reputation on the consistency of its metalwork and the reliability of its products. In 1888, he added children's tricycles to the lineup. By 1892, he had transitioned the company almost entirely to bicycles, having recognized that the bicycle boom sweeping America was not a passing enthusiasm but a genuine transformation in how people thought about personal transportation. He had 20 varieties of tricycle and more than 160 different ice chest configurations in the catalog before he stopped making either and committed entirely to two-wheeled vehicles for the upper end of the market. The bicycles were not ordinary. Pierce sourced his precision ground gears from a Detroit foundry operated by a craftsman named Henry Leland, a man whose obsession with mechanical exactitude was so profound that his shop later became the engineering foundation of the first Cadillac engine. The Pierce bicycle featured innovations that most competitors had not yet conceptualized: a cushion frame that absorbed road vibration through a mechanical anti-shock system, a coaster brake, and a suspension design that Pierce marketed under the name the Pierce Hygienic Cushion Frame, with an explicit appeal to the health-conscious rider who understood that the quality of the ride was a medical as well as a mechanical question. A Pierce bicycle in 1897 cost $75. In the context of the era, this was a serious sum. The market paid it because the product justified the price, and because Pierce had built a reputation through years of consistent delivery that made the premium feel like certainty rather than gamble. In the final years of the 19th century, the bicycle industry was being disrupted by something new. The automobile, still primitive, still mechanically unreliable, still the province of wealthy enthusiasts willing to tolerate substantial inconvenience in exchange for novelty, was beginning to look less like a curiosity and more like an inevitability. In 1900, Pierce made his first attempt at building one. He secured a license from the Overman Bicycle Company to manufacture a steam-powered car. The project failed completely. Steam-powered vehicles were mechanically demanding in ways that exceeded Pierce's existing capabilities, and they were subject to operational failures that destroyed reputations faster than they could be rebuilt. Pierce abandoned steam and pivoted to gasoline. In 1901, working with an engine licensed from the French manufacturer de Dion-Bouton, the George N. Pierce Company produced its first gasoline automobile. It was a single-cylinder machine with 2 forward speeds and no reverse gear. They called it the Motorette. Only 2 experimental units were assembled that year, and they were displayed at the Pan American Exposition held in Buffalo that summer, the World's Fair that was meant to announce Buffalo's arrival as a city of the 20th century. And that instead became famous because President William McKinley was shot by an assassin in the exposition's Temple of Music on September 6th, 2 days after touring the exhibits. The fair that introduced Pierce's automobile to the public was also the fair that changed American political history. Buffalo in 1901 existed at the intersection of ambition and catastrophe, which is perhaps a fitting birthplace for a company that would spend the next 4 decades embodying both. The motorette was a beginning. By 1903, Pierce had replaced the French engine with his own design, and the cars coming out of the Hanover Street factory, a 5-story, 75,000 square foot building on the Buffalo waterfront near the Erie Canal terminus, were already demonstrating the engineering philosophy that would define everything that followed. In 1904, Pierce made the decision that would determine the company's entire trajectory. He abandoned the small, affordable end of the market with complete finality and concentrated every resource the company possessed on a single, uncompromising product for the wealthiest buyers in America. He called it the Great Arrow. The Great Arrow was a 4-cylinder, 7-passenger touring car of a size, solidity, and finish that most competitors could not match and would not attempt. It was not designed to compete on price. It was not designed to appeal to a broad market. It was designed to be the best automobile available at any price for customers who had already decided that the best was what they intended to have. In 1905, Percy Pierce, George's son, who ran the bicycle division, drove a Great Arrow to outright victory in the Glidden Tour, the most demanding automotive endurance competition in America. 33 cars entered the 350-mile run from New York City to Bretton Woods. New Hampshire, the Great Arrow won. The victory was front-page news in the automotive press and in general circulation newspapers across the country. The order books at the Hanover Street factory filled to overflowing within weeks. The building that had once housed birdcage production was already too small for what Pierce Arrow was becoming. Something larger, something permanent, something that would announce to the country exactly what kind of company this intended to be, was urgently needed. On April 26, 1906, construction crews broke ground on the northwest corner of the former Pan American Exposition site, the same ground where Pierce had displayed his first motorette 5 years earlier to a crowd experiencing its first encounter with a gasoline automobile. There was something deliberate about returning to that specific piece of land. The exposition had been a declaration of Buffalo's industrial ambition. The factory that would rise on its former footprint was going to be that ambition made permanent in reinforced concrete. The man hired to design the new complex was Albert Kahn, a 37-year-old architect from Detroit who was in the process of inventing what would become the dominant idiom of 20th-century American industrial architecture. Kahn had already designed the Packard plant in Detroit, which had become one of the first fully realized examples of what engineers were beginning to call the daylight factory, a philosophy of industrial design, based on the insight that natural light, rational spatial organization, and single-story production flows produced better work from workers and better outcomes from machines than the dark, cramped, multi-story factory buildings of the previous industrial era. The Pierce complex would become the other canonical early exemplar of that philosophy, a building whose architectural significance would eventually be recognized by its placement on the National Register of Historic Places 68 years after it was built. The administration building, the face that Pierce Arrow would present to Elmwood Avenue and to the world, was designed separately by Buffalo architect George Carey, completed in 1908, and occupied almost the entire length of the street frontage. 3 stories of brick and stone that announced, without the need for a sign, that whatever was produced behind it was produced seriously by people who took their work seriously. Behind the administration building, connected by covered passages and linked by the rational logic of the production flow, rose the factory proper. The scale of what Kahn built was of a different order than anything Buffalo had previously seen applied to a single manufacturing enterprise. 34 acres of reinforced concrete, 1.5 million square feet of interconnected production space, 14 major buildings, each designed for a specific function in the manufacturing sequence. The manufacturing building alone was 205 feet wide and 401 feet long, its ceiling hung with 8-inch steel I-beams that carried the drive shafting and machinery across the full width of the floor below without interrupting columns. The sawtooth glass panels that ran the length of the roof distributed natural light with a mathematical evenness that eliminated shadows from the workbenches where the most precise assembly operations were conducted. The brazing building, where the intense and sustained heat of metalwork demanded constant ventilation, was fitted with monitor sash windows, designed to be operated by workers from the factory floor, a mechanical system that allowed the temperature and atmosphere of the building to be regulated without stopping the machines or leaving the production line. Along the northern edge of the complex, where the New York Central Beltline Railroad tracks ran parallel to the site boundary, a series of receiving and shipping buildings allowed raw materials to arrive and finished automobiles to depart without the two flows ever intersecting. Steel came in on one side, Pierce Arrows went out on the other. George Norman Pierce sold all his rights in the company in 1907, the year the factory was first coming into operation. He transferred control to his principal investor, George K. Burge, and the financial group that had been underwriting the enterprise since the 1890s. He was 61 years old, and he had spent 42 years building things: birdcages, ice chests, tricycles, bicycles, automobiles, and the factory on Elmwood Avenue was the largest and most consequential thing he had ever built. He walked away from it before it had reached its first full capacity. Whether this was the act of a man who recognized the limits of his energy and chose to exit cleanly, or the act of a man who understood that the enterprise had grown beyond any single person's ability to run it personally, or simply the act of a man who was tired, the historical record does not say with any precision. What the record does say is that on a Tuesday morning in March of 1910, George Norman Pierce died of a heart attack in his rooms at the Lenox Hotel on North Street in Buffalo. He was 64 years old. He died in a hotel rather than a house. A detail the city directories confirm, and that carries a particular quiet weight. The factory on Elmwood Avenue was running at full capacity on the morning he died. The machines did not pause. The steel kept moving through the presses and the lathes and the assembly stations. The engines kept being tested and disassembled and inspected and reinstalled. And the finished cars kept rolling out onto the avenue, bound for garages whose owners George Pierce had never met, carrying a standard of quality that he had established in the first year of his working life, and that the men who inherited his company would spend the next 30 years trying to maintain and ultimately fail to preserve. In 1909, 1 year before George Pierce died, the President of the United States made a decision that would define Pierce Arrow's public identity for the next quarter century. William Howard Taft, newly installed in the White House following his landslide victory over William Jennings Bryan, ordered 2 Pierce Arrows for official state use. They would be the first automobiles ever designated as official White House vehicles in American history. Every president before Taft had relied on horse-drawn carriages for formal transportation. Taft chose the automobile, and the automobile he chose was built in Buffalo. The symbolism was not lost on the company, and the commercial implications were not lost on the market. For the next 24 years, through the administrations of Taft, Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, and into the first years of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, the official vehicles of the American Executive Office were Pierce Arrows. The company that had started with birdcages was supplying the most powerful office on earth with its daily transportation. Every time an American president was photographed arriving at a state function, or departing the White House for a foreign dignitary's reception, or riding in a procession through Washington, the vehicle in the frame was built on Elmwood Avenue. The roster of private clients that accumulated around the White House account reads like a cross-section of concentrated global power rendered in names. John D. Rockefeller, whose Standard Oil empire had generated personal wealth of a scale that made the concept of price effectively irrelevant to his purchasing decisions. Mrs. Andrew Carnegie, whose husband had built the steel that built the bridges that carried the automobiles that every manufacturer in the country was now competing to sell. J. Edgar Hoover, who ran the Federal Bureau of Investigation, with a personal paranoia and institutional authority that made his choice of transportation a matter of personal brand as much as practical transportation. Orville Wright, who had invented powered flight 17 years earlier and apparently found in the Pierce Arrow's mechanical refinement something that resonated with his understanding of what engineering at its highest level could achieve. And then there were the figures whose patronage said something more specific about the range of Pierce Arrow's appeal. Babe Ruth, who earned more money playing baseball in the 1920s than the President of the United States, and spent it with the particular enthusiasm of a man who had grown up with nothing. Ginger Rogers, whose professional life demanded constant visibility and whose personal choices reflected an understanding that the objects surrounding a public figure were themselves a form of communication. John Ringling, of Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, who understood spectacle at a professional level and chose his personal transportation accordingly. The actor Sessue Hayakawa, who commissioned his Pierce Arrow in gold plate. An instruction so specific and so expensive that it stands as the most concentrated expression of what it meant to have both the money and the will to own a Pierce Arrow. The international clients were no less remarkable. Emperor Hirohito of Japan, King Albert of Belgium, King Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia, the Shah of Persia, who in 1930 commissioned a special parade car at a cost of $30,000 a vehicle, whose specifications included gold-plated exterior fittings, silk-covered interior upholstery, trim panels lined with Siberian wolfhound fur, and a jewel-encrusted royal crest mounted to the coachwork. $30,000 in 1930. The factory that made it was the same factory that 15 years earlier had made military trucks for the Western Front. The range of objects that came off the Elmwood Avenue production line, from armored anti-aircraft carriers to a fur-trimmed royal parade car, encompasses a breadth of ambition that no other manufacturer of the era could claim. What made the cars worthy of that clientele was not decoration. It was engineering conducted at a level of precision that the industry at large would not reach for another generation. Every engine produced for the flagship Model 36 was subjected to a quality control procedure that existed nowhere else in the American automobile business. The completed engine was installed on a test bench and run under load for 15 continuous hours. At the conclusion of that test, the engine was completely disassembled, every component removed, cleaned, measured, and inspected by a qualified technician against the exact tolerances specified by the engineering department. Only after that disassembly inspection was completed was the engine cleared for reinstallation in the car. The engine that reached the customer was an engine that had proven itself and been examined piece by piece. This was not a gesture toward quality. It was quality as an industrial practice, systematic and non-negotiable. The engine displacements were, by the standards of any era, extraordinary. Beginning at 453 cubic inches in the early production years, Pierce Arrow's inline six-cylinder engines grew over successive model generations to a peak displacement of 825 cubic inches, 13.5 liters of engine in a passenger car chassis. At the time of its introduction, this was the largest production automobile engine ever built anywhere on Earth. It was not a racing engine. It was not designed for maximum power output. It was a touring engine, engineered for the effortless, almost meditative forward motion that characterized the Pierce Arrow driving experience. The sense that the road, however demanding, was simply not a serious obstacle to the machine being asked to traverse it. Into this engineering culture, in 1912, arrived Herbert M. Dawley. Dawley was recruited by company president Charles Clifton after winning a public design competition that Pierce Arrow had organized to find new creative talent, and his background tells you something essential about the kind of imagination the company was acquiring. He was not primarily an engineer. He was an artist, a man who would eventually leave the automobile industry to pursue a career as a Broadway actor and director, a trajectory that, in retrospect, explains the particular quality of the visual solutions he produced. From the moment of his hiring in 1912 until the last car rolled off the production line in 1938, Dawley designed virtually every Pierce Arrow made. He created the helmeted Archer hood ornament, introduced on the 1928 model that became one of the most recognized automotive mascots of the era. And on February 24, 1914, he received a patent for the invention that would make Pierce Arrow visually unmistakable for the rest of the company's existence. The fender headlight changed the automobile's visual language in a way that had not been accomplished since the introduction of the enclosed body. Prior to Dolly's solution, headlights on every automobile were mounted on conventional bracket supports positioned beside the radiator, a standardized placement that made every car on the road look essentially identical in its frontal aspect, regardless of the quality or character of what lay behind the headlight. Dolly moved Pierce Arrow's lights off the brackets entirely and embedded them in flared, trumpet-shaped housings that were molded directly into the contour of the front fenders. The engineering justification was sound and measurable. The higher mounting position and the wider lateral spread of the fender placement provided significantly better road illumination on curves and at elevation changes. At night, the practical improvement was real, but the visual consequence was something else entirely. At night, a Pierce Arrow approached with an apparent width and visual authority that no other automobile on the road could match. The lights emerged from the fenders as if they had grown there, as if the car had evolved them organically rather than having them attached as an afterthought. The effect was immediately recognizable, immediately distinctive, and impossible to confuse with any other vehicle. Pierce patented the placement. No other manufacturer could replicate it, and the configuration would remain on every Pierce Arrow produced until the last car was assembled in 1938, becoming so completely identified with the mark that the car and the headlight were, in the public consciousness, the same thing. But here's the shadow that fell across this triumph from the very beginning. The fender headlight was illegal in New York State for years after its introduction. Pierce Arrow's own home state, the state where the factory stood, where the workers lived, where the company paid its taxes and held its corporate charter, had determined that the configuration did not comply with existing regulations. The company was forced to offer its most famous and defining design feature as a mere option, available to customers who were willing to manage the legal complications, while simultaneously offering a conventional bracket-mounted alternative for customers who were not. Most customers ordered the fender lights regardless. A minority, deterred by the legal complexity or simply preferring the more conventional appearance, chose the bracket alternative, and those cars stripped of the feature that made a Pierce Arrow recognizable from 3 blocks away at night looked like any other expensive automobile of the era. They looked, in the most specific possible sense, like something lesser. It was the first indication that the most carefully and brilliantly made things do not always find the world ready to receive them on their own terms. Then the war came, and for a few extraordinary years the question of whether Pierce Arrow could sustain its position in a changing luxury market became, temporarily, completely irrelevant. The modern world in 1914 needed trucks. Heavy, reliable, consistent trucks, capable of carrying military supplies across the rutted roads of northern France, in conditions that would destroy ordinary commercial vehicles within weeks. No company in America built heavier or more reliable trucks than the factory on Elmwood Avenue, and the Allied governments knew it. The Pierce Arrow commercial truck line had been in operation since 1911, producing vehicles for domestic freight and municipal use. When the European War began in August of 1914, and it became clear within months that the conflict would be decided as much by logistics as by battlefield tactics, the French and British governments began placing orders with American manufacturers for military transport vehicles. Pierce Arrow received contracts measured not in dozens, but in hundreds, and then in thousands. The factory production floor, which had been organized for the careful, deliberate assembly of luxury passenger cars, was reconfigured for the urgent, continuous production of military hardware. By the end of the war, Pierce Arrow had delivered over 14,000 trucks to the Allied forces, vehicles that moved ammunition and food and medical supplies along the supply lines that kept the Western Front operational. The British Royal Marine Artillery found a use for the Pierce Arrow truck that neither George Pierce nor Albert Kahn had imagined when they built the factory. In December of 1914, the British Admiralty placed an order for 48 Pierce Arrow 5-ton truck chassis to be converted into self-propelled anti-aircraft gun carriers, armored vehicles mounting QF 2-pounder rapid-fire guns on rotating turrets, capable of tracking and engaging enemy aircraft. These were the world's first mobile anti-aircraft batteries. The first Pierce Arrow-based battery arrived at the Western Front in late April of 1915. On April 30th, 2 days after arrival, A Pierce Arrow anti-aircraft battery shot down the first enemy aircraft ever destroyed by a mobile ground battery in the history of warfare. The chassis that George Pierce's engineers had designed for Buffalo's freight roads were shooting German aircraft out of the sky above the Ypres salient before the vehicles were 3 weeks old. At home, the factory ran at a scale and an intensity that no peacetime operation could have demanded. Employment reached nearly 10,000 men and women by 1915. Pierce Arrow publicly announced that it was using more aluminum than any other enterprise anywhere in the world. Annual profits reached $4 million, a figure that, set against the humble origins of the Birdcage Company on Hanover Street, represents one of the more spectacular industrial transformations in American business history. In 1916, riding the wartime windfall, the company executed its first public stock offering, $10.7 million, raised to fund a major expansion of the Elmwood Avenue complex. George K. Burge, the investor who had been the company's controlling financial figure since the 1890s, retired in 1916 and sold approximately half his remaining stock for $7 million. He had backed the right man and the right philosophy, and the market had rewarded him accordingly. But Burge's departure was not merely a financial transaction, it was a generational transfer. The men who replaced him at the top of the organization were, by all available accounts, competent and diligent administrators. They understood the company's reputation. They understood its financial structure. They understood the quality standards that the factory operated under and the importance of maintaining them. What they lacked, and what they would demonstrate the lack of over the next decade in ways that would prove fatal, was the willingness to question the assumptions that the founding generation had built into the company's identity. In 1914, Cadillac had introduced its V8 engine, a configuration that offered smoother power delivery and a more modern engineering profile than the inline configurations that had dominated the luxury market. The following year, Packard unveiled the Twin Six, a 12-cylinder engine that announced with unmistakable clarity that the architectural future of the high-performance automobile engine was not about displacement in an inline cylinder bank, but about the arrangement and balance of cylinders in more complex configurations. These were not minor adjustments to existing technology. They were declarations of a new direction, and every serious engineer and every informed observer in the automotive industry understood them as such. Pierce Arrow's management looked at both developments, considered them carefully, and dismissed them. The company's official position, stated in internal planning documents, reflected in the product development roadmap, and ultimately inscribed in the institutional culture of the engineering department, was that a true luxury automobile should be powered by a smooth, quiet, inline six-cylinder engine. The V8 and V12 were interesting engineering exercises. They would not endure. The inline six was the correct solution. And Pierce Arrow had been building the correct solution for 10 years, and the market had rewarded that judgment consistently, and there was no compelling reason to abandon it now. The reasoning was not entirely irrational. It was, however, wrong. And the cost of being wrong on a question of fundamental product direction in a competitive industry is not paid immediately. It is paid in installments, slowly, over years, by which time the debt has grown too large to retire. When the armistice was signed in November of 1918 and the military contracts evaporated overnight, Pierce Arrow found itself in the position that every successful wartime manufacturer occupied: an enormous factory, a large and skilled workforce, and the necessity of redetermining what the civilian market needed and how to provide it at a price that would sustain the operation. The answer, in the short term, was the continuation of the established luxury car line. The factory could produce it. The customers who had bought Pierce Arrows before the war could afford them again. The brand's reputation was intact, reinforced, if anything, by the wartime production record and the Allied government's trust in the company's engineering. But the sales numbers that followed the war told a quieter and more troubling story. In 1921, the company sold 1,444 cars. In 1922, 1,240. These were the worst years in the company's history to that point, and they were occurring inside a factory designed for volumes 20 times higher. The factory that had employed 10,000 people in the war years was now running at a fraction of its capacity, producing cars at a rate that made the overhead costs increasingly difficult to justify. The men directing Pierce Arrow through the 1920s were not fools. They were something more dangerous than fools. They were genuine believers in a philosophy that had, up to that point, been consistently validated by the market. They had inherited a company whose reputation was so deeply embedded in the consciousness of wealthy American buyers that it was genuinely difficult to see how it could fail. The three Ps of Motordom, Pierce Arrow, Packard, and Peerless were the acknowledged pinnacle of American luxury automobile manufacturing, and within that trinity, Pierce Arrow wore the crown of uncompromising quality. Packard was admired, Peerless was respected, Pierce Arrow was revered, but Packard's management was asking a question that Pierce Arrow's management had decided was not worth asking. The question was, what happens to your luxury flagship when you have no volume product generating the cash flow necessary to fund its ongoing development? Packard had recognized in the early 1920s that the answer to this question was uncomfortable but actionable. In 1921, the company introduced the Single Six, a more affordable automobile aimed at the upper middle class, rather than the ultra-wealthy. It was not a Packard in the traditional sense of the word. It did not carry the full weight of Packard's engineering heritage or its pricing structure, but it sold in numbers that kept the factory running and the engineers paid, and it gave the company the financial foundation to continue developing and refining the prestige models that maintained its reputation. Pierce Arrow watched this happen from its offices on Elmwood Avenue and drew no operational conclusions from it. The company's position, never formally articulated but consistently reflected in every product decision made through the decade, was that a cheaper Pierce Arrow was not a Pierce Arrow. It was something else. And something else was not acceptable. The company would continue producing the finest automobile available at any price, for customers who required the finest, and the market for the finest would sustain the operation. This belief was sincere. It was also, in retrospect, the belief that would eventually make everything else impossible. By 1927, the product lineup had been reduced to two models, the Model 80 and the flagship Model 36, and the engineering department had a straight-eight engine sitting on the drawing board that it had been unable to build for years because the company lacked the capital to bring it to production. The Model 36's existing 414 cubic inch T-head six-cylinder was a magnificent piece of engineering. 24 valves, twin ignition, 100 horsepower, bench-tested with the same 15-hour protocol that had always governed Pierce Arrow's quality assurance. It was, in every technical sense, a superb engine. It was also, by the standards of the 1920s luxury market, increasingly out of fashion, an artifact of an engineering philosophy that the industry had moved away from while Pierce Arrow was declining to follow. The financial position by 1928 was serious enough to require outside intervention. The company needed capital to build the cars its engineers had already designed, and that capital was not available internally. After extended negotiations, Pierce Arrow accepted an offer from the Studebaker Corporation of South Bend, Indiana. Alfred R. Erskine, Studebaker's president, paid $5.7 million in stock for controlling interest in the company. His strategic logic was clear. Studebaker wanted a prestigious nameplate for the upper end of the market, and Pierce Arrow wanted money to build competitive automobiles. The arrangement preserved Pierce Arrow's operational independence. Studebaker would cast the engines in its South Bend foundry, but no components were shared between the brands. And the cars from Elmwood Avenue would continue to be designed, assembled, and finished entirely by Pierce Arrow's own people. In the administration building on Elmwood Avenue, there was genuine relief when the deal was finalized. The straight-eight engine could finally be built. The factory could be modernized. The company had found a guardian. What nobody said, and what perhaps nobody at the management level had fully understood, was that accepting Studebaker's money meant accepting. Eventually, Studebaker's judgment about what Pierce Arrow needed to become, and accepting another company's judgment about its own identity, was the one thing Pierce Arrow had never in its history been willing to do. 1929 was the best year the company had ever recorded. The Studebaker capital had funded the new L-head straight-eight engine that the engineering department had been developing for years, and the market responded to a genuinely competitive, genuinely modern Pierce Arrow with purchasing decisions that produced a record 9,700 units sold. The showrooms in Buffalo and the dealerships operating through Studebaker's national sales network were moving cars at a pace that felt, from inside the company, like the return of the momentum that had defined the war years. The factory was running. The engineers were building the cars they had always wanted to build. The philosophy was intact. Then October arrived. The Wall Street crash of October 1929 did not immediately register in Pierce Arrow's commercial performance. And this delay was itself a trap. 1930 produced 6,795 sales, the second best year in the company's entire history. Management surveyed this result and reached a conclusion that was understandable, given the data available to them, and catastrophically wrong given the data that was not. The luxury market was insulated from the broader economic collapse. The men who could afford a Pierce Arrow were not the men losing their deposits in failing banks. The wealthy had cushioned themselves. Pierce Arrow was safe. The 4,522 sales of 1931 suggested otherwise, and the specific corporate decision made in the face of that declining number to develop and introduce the V12 engine that Chief Engineer Karl Wise had been designing, were at precisely the moment when the luxury market was contracting toward a fraction of its previous scale, reveals the depth of the institutional conviction that was governing the company's choices. The V12 was, in engineering terms, exactly what Pierce Arrow needed. It was comparable to the Packard 12 in displacement and architecture. Available in two configurations producing up to 150 horsepower and fitted to body styles constructed by coach builders of the first-rank LeBaron, Dietrich, Derham, working on a chassis of exceptional quality. The 1932 Pierce Arrow Phi 12 was arguably the most technically accomplished automobile the company had produced in 30 years of operation. It was also being built and sold in the middle of the most severe economic contraction in American history, at a price point that even the wealthy were reconsidering, by a company that had just been informed by the bankruptcy proceedings of its parent corporation that its guardian angel had run out of resources. In March of 1933, Studebaker filed for receivership. The corporation that had paid $5.7 million for Pierce Arrow 5 years earlier was compelled by its creditors to liquidate the asset at whatever price the distressed market would accept. A group of Buffalo businessmen and investors assembled the capital to purchase the company. They paid $1 million. The controlling interest in Pierce Arrow had lost 83% of its value in 5 years. The new owners were not ignorant of what they had bought. They understood that the brand still commanded genuine prestige, that the factory still contained skilled workers and capable engineers, and that the cars being produced on Elmwood Avenue were still among the finest in the world. They restructured the organization, established a break-even target of 3,000 cars per year, and announced their intention to continue operations. In 1933, the company sold 2,152 cars. The math was broken from the first month of the new ownership, and the men in charge looked at the number, looked at the cars, and held their position. While the financial projections were being constructed and revised in the administration building, Karl Wise was in the engineering department doing something that had no connection to financial projections, and every connection to what Pierce Arrow had always believed itself to be. He was building a car that the world had not yet seen. He was building the Silver Arrow. The commission that produced the Silver Arrow was specific in its ambition. Pierce Arrow needed a presence at the January 1933 New York Auto Show that would demonstrate, without qualification, that the company from Buffalo was still capable of leading the industry rather than following it. Cadillac was bringing a showcase car. Lincoln was bringing a showcase car. Packard was bringing a showcase car. The Depression had paradoxically created a moment in which the luxury manufacturers needed to prove their relevance more urgently than at any point in their histories, and the tool they had chosen was spectacle. Pierce Arrow's spectacle was designed by Philip O. Wright and engineered by Wise, and when it was unveiled in January of that year, every journalist in the room understood immediately that they were looking at something that would not appear on anyone else's production line for at least a decade. The Silver Arrow's body was a fastback of aerodynamic proportions that had not existed in automotive design up to that moment. The spare tires, which on every other automobile of the era protruded from fender-mounted external carriers in a way that was simultaneously practical and visually ungainly, were hidden entirely concealed within specially engineered compartments built into the lower section of the front fenders. Accessible through flush-mounted doors that closed so precisely against the body surface that their seams were almost invisible at casual inspection. The roofline swept continuously from the windshield pillar to the tail without the formal interruption of a notchback trunk, creating a silhouette that looked less like an automobile of 1933 and more like a projection of what an automobile of 1945 might eventually become. The V-shaped grille tapered into a hood that was lower than anything else in the luxury class. The fender headlights Dolly's innovation, now 19 years established, were integrated into the new body with a fluency that made them appear as organic features of the design, rather than components added after the fact. And beneath the hood, the V12 engine produced sufficient power to push the Silver Arrow to 115 miles per hour, a figure so far beyond the practical requirements of any road that existed in America in 1933 that it functioned less as a performance specification and more as a philosophical statement about what the company was capable of when the only constraint it recognized was excellence. The company launched the car with a slogan that captured its temporal ambition without the slightest exaggeration. Suddenly, it's 1940. The journalists in the New York showroom ran out of superlatives within the first hour. The public that came through the doors on subsequent days stood around the Silver Arrow in the particular concentrated silence that genuinely astonishing objects produce the silence of people who are looking at something they have never seen before and are trying to understand exactly what category of experience they are having. The automotive press unanimously identified the Silver Arrow as the most significant new automobile unveiled anywhere in the world in 1933. Pierce Arrow had demonstrated, to the satisfaction of everyone in attendance, that the company from Buffalo was not a relic of a previous era. It was the leading edge of the next one. The price was $10,000. They sold 5. 5 Silver Arrows were built. 5 customers in the entire United States during the worst economic crisis the country had experienced in its history were willing to pay $10,000 for an automobile, even an automobile of this quality, of this ambition, of this historical significance. 3 of the 5 survive today, preserved with the care that objects of extraordinary rarity and meaning receive from people who understand what they represent. One sold at auction in 2012 for $2,200,000. The car that proved Pierce Arrow's undiminished genius, that demonstrated beyond any possible doubt that the company could still lead the world in automotive design and engineering, had found 5 customers at the moment of its unveiling, and would eventually find a single buyer willing to pay $2 million for it 80 years later. The commercial mathematics of that trajectory contain everything important about what was happening to Pierce Arrow. Pierce Arrow looked at the Silver Arrow's reception and at its sales record and made its decision. The company would not introduce a cheaper model. It would not seek a broader market by adjusting the price of what it offered. The philosophy was not negotiable, and the philosophy said that Pierce Arrow built the finest automobile available at any price, or it built nothing. There was no intermediate category. There was no Pierce Arrow for people who could afford almost, but not quite, a Pierce Arrow. Packard watched the Silver Arrow and drew the correct operational conclusion. In 1935, Packard introduced the 120, a near-luxury automobile priced for the upper middle class, built on a shorter wheelbase, powered by a smaller engine, wearing the Packard name without carrying the full weight of Packard's traditional engineering standards. It was an act of deliberate self-compromise, and Packard's management understood it as such. It was also the act that saved the company. The 120 generated the sales volume and the cash flow that allowed Packard to continue producing the senior models that maintained its prestige at the top of the market, and to survive the Depression as a functioning enterprise. Lincoln introduced the Zephyr. Cadillac operated under the General Motors umbrella and had access to resources that the independents could never match. Every major American luxury manufacturer either adapted to the new reality or found an institutional structure that insulated it from the full force of that reality. Pierce Arrow adapted to nothing and was insulated by nothing. The cars assembled on Elmwood Avenue through 19. 34, 35, and 36 were by many technical assessments the most accomplished Pierce Arrows ever produced. The 1934 models offered adjustable rear seats, draft-free ventilating windows, and V12 engines in multiple configurations. The coach builders LeBaron Dietrich Derham continued producing bespoke body styles on the Pierce Arrow chassis that demonstrated the car's underlying architecture was as valid as anything in the world luxury market. The 15-hour engine test continued. The disassembly inspection continued. Every surface was finished to the standard. Every component was fitted to the tolerance. The quality had not diminished by a single measurable degree. 1935, 1,740 sales. 1936, 875. 1937, 166. 166 Pierce Arrows left the Elmwood Avenue factory in 1937. The building that Albert Kahn had designed for production at the scale of the American industrial ambition, 14 interconnected structures, 1.5 million square feet, the most advanced factory complex in the history of the Buffalo automobile industry, was producing in its best weeks approximately 3 or 4 cars. The workforce that had numbered 10,000 in 1915 had been reduced to a fraction sufficient to maintain minimal production. Supplier invoices were going unpaid. Credit was being extended under conditions that the creditors were finding increasingly difficult to justify against the financial evidence of the company's performance. And then, in the final operating year, there were the trailers. Beginning in 1936, Pierce Arrow had launched a line of luxury camping trailers under the name Travelodge. There were 3 models: a 19-foot Model A for customers who required the most substantial option, a 16.5-foot Model B for the middle of the range, and a 13.5-foot Model C, the smallest configuration, of which only 74 examples were ever built. The trailers were outfitted with gas stoves, built-in ice chests, fresh water tanks, and folding dining areas. They were well made. Everything that left this factory was well made. Approximately 450 Travelodge units were produced across 1937 and 38. Each one assembled with the same attention to fit and finish that had characterized every product the company had made since George Pierce first applied the standards of the birdcage business to the bicycle business and then to the automobile business. The company that had built the official vehicles of the American presidency for 24 consecutive years, that had constructed a $30,000 gold and silk and fur parade car for the Shah of Persia, that had produced the Silver Arrow, the car that the automotive press had unanimously declared the most advanced design in the world, was spending its final operating months engineering the fold-out dining table of a recreational vehicle. This was not a failure of craftsmanship. It was not a failure of engineering capability. It was a failure of strategic imagination of a very specific kind. The failure to conceive of a world that had changed irreversibly, and the failure to build anything that might survive inside that world on terms different from the ones the company had always imposed. December 1937. Pierce Arrow declared bankruptcy for the final time. Just 2 months after the company had formally announced its 1938 model lineup, the marketing materials had been printed, the advertisements had run in the automotive press. Approximately 17 cars from the announced lineup were actually produced. Suppliers who had been extending credit under increasingly difficult conditions withdrew it entirely when the bankruptcy filing removed any reasonable expectation of payment. A final plan was assembled and circulated to potential investors. $10 million to be used to produce 25,000 medium-priced automobiles alongside 1,200 luxury models. The volume and prestige dual strategy that the company had refused to adopt when it might have saved the operation was now being proposed as the instrument of its resurrection. No investor came forward, not one. Karl Wise, the chief engineer who had designed the V12, who had overseen the Silver Arrow's development, who had spent his professional life in the service of the standard that Pierce Arrow represented, assembled the final Pierce Arrow personally. He obtained the necessary components from the company's receivers, the court-appointed administrators managing the bankruptcy liquidation, and he built the last car alone in the dying factory. It was not a sentimental gesture. It was the act of a craftsman who understood that something of consequence was ending, and who felt the professional obligation to ensure that it ended with one last example built to the full standard, rather than trailing off into diminishing approximations of what the cars were supposed to be. The remaining assets of the Pierce Arrow Motor Car Company were sold at auction on a Friday, May 13th, 1938. The date carries its own bleak symbolism. The factory equipment used to manufacture the V12 engines, precision machinery built to specifications that no competitor had replicated and no fire apparatus company could have designed independently, was purchased by Seagrave Fire Apparatus of Columbus, Ohio. For the years that followed, the tooling that had shaped the most powerful passenger car engine in American production history was used to manufacture engines for fire trucks. The steel that had been machined to the tolerances required by a luxury automobile destined for a royal garage was repurposed to build the power plants of the vehicles that raced through ordinary neighborhoods at 3 a.m. to save ordinary people's homes. The power that had served the richest people on earth was redirected without ceremony toward the protection of everyone else. The factory is still there. 34 acres of Albert Kahn's reinforced concrete on the corner of Elmwood Avenue and Great Arrow Avenue in North Buffalo. It standing on the same ground where George Pierce first showed a gasoline automobile to a crowd that had never seen one. The sawtooth glass panels in the production floor's roofline still catch the available light and scatter it downward, though the floor they illuminate now holds loft apartments rather than assembly lines. And the machines that once ran continuously beneath that glass have been gone for 87 years. The administration building that George Carey designed in 1908, the 3-story brick face that Pierce Arrow presented to the world, the building where the decisions were made that built the empire and then refused to save it, has been converted into residential lofts. A geothermal energy system runs beneath the building that once housed the executive offices where management decided, year after year, and with increasing certainty, that a cheaper Pierce Arrow was not a Pierce Arrow. The complex was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1974, 36 years after the last car left the building. Portions of the original factory complex have been absorbed by small businesses and light industrial tenants. Other portions are abandoned, their interiors accessible to the urban explorers who document what remains of the American industrial past. In 1997, James Sandoro and his wife Mary Ann opened a museum at 263 Michigan Avenue in downtown Buffalo, in a former Mack truck showroom a mile from the Elmwood Avenue factory. Sandoro had first encountered a Pierce Arrow as a child in Buffalo in the 1940s, one of the surviving cars, still running decades after the factory that made it had closed, parked somewhere in the city with the particular self-possession of an object that knows what it is. He had spent the following 50 years collecting everything connected to the company: the automobiles themselves, the company memorabilia and literature, the factory artifacts, the photographic record of what had been built on Elmwood Avenue and what it had looked like while it was still operating. The museum that emerged from that collection is one of the most specific and intentional automotive institutions in the country, a place that exists not merely to preserve machines, but to make an argument about industrial ambition, about the particular genius that Buffalo once concentrated within its city limits, and about what is lost when that genius disappears. The museum's centerpiece is not a car. It is a building, a full-scale, accurately constructed replica of a gasoline filling station that Frank Lloyd Wright designed in 1927 for a Buffalo site, a commission that was never executed during Wright's lifetime. The station was built to Wright's exact original specifications inside the museum's main gallery, and it is one of 3 posthumously constructed Wright buildings in Buffalo, alongside the Blue Sky Mausoleum at Forest Lawn Cemetery and the Fontana Boathouse on the Niagara River. The presence of a Wright building inside a Pierce Arrow museum is not coincidental. Both Wright and Pierce Arrow were products of the same cultural moment, the belief, widespread in early 20th century American industrial and architectural culture, that the highest standard of craftsmanship was not a luxury, but an obligation, and that objects built to that standard would endure regardless of the economic pressures arrayed against them. Wright's work has endured. The Pierce Arrow cars have endured. The company that built them did not. On August 12, 2019, the United States Trademark Trial and Appeal Board issued a ruling of legal significance beyond the narrow automotive context. The name Pierce Arrow cannot be registered as a trademark for automobile production by any unrelated third party. The ruling established new precedent for the protection of what the law calls collective membership marks, the shared heritage of a community of enthusiasts and historians who maintain the identity and significance of a mark that no longer has a corporate owner to protect it. A Swiss group had attempted in 2006 to revive the name using a vehicle designed by the industrial designer Luigi Colani, a 24-cylinder, 10-liter machine of extraordinary ambition that never proceeded beyond the announcement phase. The project is defunct. The name held. The Pierce Arrow Society, founded in 1957, continues to track the surviving cars, approximately 3,000 examples, from a production run of roughly 80,000 distributed among private collections, museums, and garages across the country and around the world. The survivors are maintained by people who understand, at some level, that what they are preserving is not just a vehicle, but a document, a physical record of what it looked like when a company meant exactly what it said about quality, for as long as it was capable of meaning it. The next time you stand in front of one of these cars in the museum on Michigan Avenue, or at a concours on a summer lawn, or in a private collection where one of the surviving examples has been kept running for a century by someone who grasped immediately what they were looking at, pay attention to the headlights. Notice how they emerge from the fenders as if the car grew them, as if they were a natural feature of the design, rather than a component attached by engineers after the essential form had been determined. Notice the weight of the hood when you open it, the density of the metal, the precision of the hinges, the way everything is held in alignment by tolerances that were set and verified and set again before the car was released. Listen, if the engine is running to the specific acoustic character of 12 cylinders arranged in absolute mechanical harmony, not the aggressive sound of power being released under pressure, but the composed, unhurried sound of power being managed by a machine that has more of it than any road is likely to require. What you are hearing is the record of a decision made in Buffalo in the first years of the 20th century and held without modification for 38 years afterward. The decision was this: we will build the finest automobile available at any price, and we will never build anything less, and the market will sustain us as long as we hold to that standard. The decision made Pierce Arrow immortal. It made the cars worth preserving. It made the Silver Arrow worth $2,200,000 80 years after it was built, and it made the ordinary production cars worth the attention and the care that the 3,000 survivors continue to receive from the people who own them. It also closed the factory. The cars on Elmwood Avenue stopped being built, not because the craftsmen ran out of skill, or the engineers ran out of ideas, or the management ran out of courage. They stopped because the world, the company, had been built to serve the world of unconstrained luxury spending, of presidential fleets and royal commissions, of $10,000 show cars sold to 5 customers, had contracted to a size that could not support the overhead of 1.5 million square feet of reinforced concrete and the workforce and the supplier relationships required to fill it. And when the market offered Pierce Arrow the choice available to every other luxury manufacturer: build something cheaper, sell to a broader world, stay alive, the company considered the choice and declined it. You are looking at the consequence of that decision every time you look at a surviving Pierce Arrow. The steel that was machined to those tolerances, tested for 15 hours, disassembled and inspected and reinstalled, is the steel that outlasted the company that shaped it. The factory on Elmwood Avenue is a ruin and a monument simultaneously. What was built there was beautiful, and it was uncompromising, and it was, in the most specific possible sense, exactly what it claimed to be. The philosophy held. The company did not. And the distance between those two facts is where the entire Pierce Arrow story lives.